Imagine waking up one morning and the world has changed overnight. The supreme leader of one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East is dead. Missiles are raining on cities. Oil prices are spiking globally. And a war that experts warned about for decades has finally arrived. This is not a movie. This is not fiction. This happened on February 28th, 2026. And to truly understand what is happening right now, you need to go back. Way back. Because this conflict did not start in 2026. It did not start in 2025. It did not even start in 2023. The roots of this war are deep, they are old, and they are soaked in ideology. So stay with me, because by the end of this video you will understand this conflict in a way that most news channels will never take the time to explain to you. Let us begin. Iran and Israel have been engaged in a proxy conflict since 1985. But here's the part that most people do not know. Iran and Israel were once close allies. You heard that right. Before 1979, these two nations had warm relations. They shared intelligence. They traded. They cooperated on regional security. Motivated by the periphery doctrine, Imperial Iran and Israel had close relations, seeing Arab powers as a common threat. Both nations looked at the Arab world and saw a shared enemy. That partnership ended overnight. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution swept through Iran. The Shah was gone. Ayatollah Khomeini was in power. And with that change came a complete ideological reversal. The Iranian government of Ruhollah Khomeini severed all existing ties with Israel after seizing power from the Pahlavi dynasty, including by transferring the embassy of Israel in Tehran to the Palestine Liberation Organization. Think about that for a moment. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was handed over to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That is not just a diplomatic break. That is a declaration of war in slow motion. As guided by the Islamic Revolution's ideology, Iran's foreign policy is primarily focused on destroying Israel and replacing it entirely with a Palestinian state. In Israel's response, the Israeli government regards Iran as an existential threat owing to the country's backing of various militant groups across the region. So from that point on, these two countries began building their arsenals. And they began building armies that did not wear their flags. These are what we call proxies. Iran did not just go to war with Israel directly in those early years. It built an entire network of armed groups across the Middle East. This network was called the Axis of Resistance. The Quds Force has also provided advanced armed drones to Hezbollah in Lebanon, trained and funded more than 100,000 Shiite fighters in Syria, supplied ballistic missiles and drones to Yemen's Houthis, and helped Shiite militias in Iraq build missile capabilities. That is an enormous military ecosystem, all funded, all trained, all pointed in one direction. And at the center of this network was a man named Hassan Nasrallah. He led Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah was not just a militia, it was Iran's crown jewel. In Lebanon, the powerful terror group Hezbollah had long been considered Iran's first line of defense in case of a war with Israel. It was believed to have some 150,000 rockets and missiles, and the group's former leader Hassan Nasrallah once boasted of having 100,000 fighters. That is not a militia, that is an army, one that Iran had spent decades building and arming just across Israel's northern border. But here's where the story begins to accelerate. October 7th, 2023. That date changed everything. On 7 October 2023, Hamas, a Palestinian militant group partially funded by Iran, launched an attack on Israel, resulting in the deaths of almost 2,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, and the outbreak of the Gaza war. And what most people still do not fully grasp is the extent of Iran's involvement in that attack. The Wall Street Journal cited senior Hamas and Hezbollah members who said the IRGC helped plan the assault and gave the go-ahead during its Sitzagund October meeting in Beirut. Days before the attack, a meeting in Beirut, Iran gave the green light. In the lead up to the attack, about 500 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters reportedly received training in Iran under the supervision of the IRGC Quds Force. This was not a spontaneous act. This was a calculated strategic move, and Israel's response was ferocious. The Gaza war began. But this time, Israel decided it would not just respond in Gaza. It would begin dismantling the entire axis of resistance, piece by piece, one by one, starting with the heads, December 2023. On 25th of December, Razi Mousavi, an Iranian commander, was killed in a targeted Israeli airstrike at his residence in Saida Zainab, 10 kilometers south of Damascus, amid the Gaza war. Mousavi's assassination marked the highest-ranking killing of a senior Iranian military official since the targeted assassination of Qasem Soleimani, January 2024. More Iranian generals targeted in Syria. The assassinations were accelerating. Then came April 1st, 2024, and Iran crossed a line it had not crossed in decades. On 1st April, Israel bombed an Iranian consulate complex in Damascus, Syria, killing multiple senior Iranian officials. This was extraordinary. An attack on a consulate is technically an attack on sovereign Iranian soil, and Iran could not let that go unanswered. In response, Iran and its axis of resistance allies seized the Israeli-linked ship MSC Ares and launched strikes inside Israel on 13th April. This was the first time in decades that Iran had directly struck Israeli territory. The world held its breath. Israel then carried out retaliatory strikes in Iran and Syria on 19th April. The Israeli strikes were limited, and analysts say they signaled a desire to de-escalate. Iran did not respond to the attack, and tensions de-escalated back down to the proxy war. Both sides blinked. Both sides pulled back. For a moment, it seemed like the region had avoided a catastrophe. But the summer of 2024 had more shocks in store. July 31st, 2024. 2 assassinations in one day. On 31st July, Fuad Shukr, a senior Hezbollah commander, was assassinated in an Israeli strike on Haret Reik in the suburbs of the Lebanese capital Beirut. Iranian military advisor Milad Beidi and civilians were also killed in the strike. And then hours later, Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, was assassinated along with his personal bodyguard in the Iranian capital Tehran by an apparent Israeli attack. Haniyeh was killed in his accommodation in a military-run guest house after attending the inauguration ceremony for Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian inside Iran. The message was unmistakable. Iran was humiliated. And in September 2024, the unthinkable happened. Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah. Israel assassinated Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and prominent IRGC commander Abbas Nilfarushan in Lebanon in September 2024. The man who had led Hezbollah for decades. The man Iran had spent billions of dollars protecting. Gone. In a single airstrike in Beirut, Hezbollah was not just weakened, it was decapitated. Iran responded on October 1st, 2024. On Thursday, October 2024, Iran launched between 180 and 200 missiles against Israel, and what it said was retaliation for the killing of the Hamas political leader, the leader of Hezbollah, and a commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 180 to 200 ballistic missiles, fired at a country the size of New Jersey. But what happened next was something Iran had not anticipated. The latter, Israeli strikes, destroyed nearly all of Iran's Russian-supplied defensive S-300 missile systems, paving the way for potential future Israeli strikes. Israel's counterstrike was surgical. It did not just hit Iranian targets. It destroyed Iran's air defense network. In one night, Iran went from being a country protected by sophisticated Russian missile defense systems to being essentially open sky. The chessboard had shifted, and inside Israel's military planners, a clock was ticking. Because the window to strike Iran's nuclear program was opening wider with every passing month. Now, let us pause here and talk about the nuclear question. Because this is the heartbeat of everything. Iran's nuclear program has terrified both Israel and the United States for over 2 decades. Iran's development of nuclear enrichment capabilities has been an international controversy for decades, with Israel and its allies seeking to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons development. In 2015, a deal was reached. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA. Iran agreed to freeze its nuclear program in exchange for lifted sanctions. The world exhaled. But then came Donald Trump's first term. In 2018, United States President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the plan. Iran began stockpiling enriched uranium and largely suspended International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring. That withdrawal had consequences that reverberated for years. Iran's nuclear program did not stop. It accelerated. By 2025, Iran was closer to having enough enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon than at any point in its history. And Israel's position was simple and unwavering. It would never allow Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. Not ever. Not under any circumstances. So while the diplomatic dance continued, the military clock was ticking louder and louder. Then came June 2025. The 12-day war was an armed conflict between Iran and Israel which lasted from 13 to 24 June 2025. It began when Israel bombed military and nuclear facilities in Iran in a surprise attack, assassinating prominent military leaders, nuclear scientists, and politicians, killing civilians and damaging or destroying air defenses. Israel had finally done it. The strike that every analyst had predicted for years. Iran retaliated with over 550 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 suicide drones hitting civilian population centers, 1 hospital, and at least 12 military energy and government sites. 550 ballistic missiles. This was not a skirmish. This was open war. The United States intercepted Iranian attacks and bombed 3 Iranian nuclear sites on 22nd June. Iran retaliated by firing missiles at a United States base in Qatar. The United States was now in it. The conflict had crossed a threshold that changed the entire calculation for every nation in the region. On 24th June, Israel and Iran agreed to a ceasefire under United States pressure. The 12-day war ended. A fragile peace settled over the region, but the underlying tensions had not been resolved. They had only been compressed, like a coiled spring, waiting. December 2025. Something was happening inside Iran that no one had fully anticipated. Beginning in late December 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests erupted in Iran. Originally driven by discontent over the economic crisis, they escalated into explicit calls for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic government. The protests became the largest in scale since the 1979 revolution, with 5 million Iranians protesting, 5 million people in the streets, calling for the end of the Islamic Republic. This was the regime's worst nightmare, and its response was brutal. The Iranian government responded with massacres of protesters, with the deadliest incidents occurring on 8 to 10th January 2026. Tens of thousands killed. The world watched in horror. In Washington, Donald Trump issued warnings. The military buildup in the region began to grow. Aircraft carrier groups repositioned. Warships moved into the eastern Mediterranean. Stealth bombers transferred to forward bases. The writing was on the wall. But here's a detail that gets lost in the headlines. On 25 February 2026, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that a historic agreement with the United States to avert military conflict was within reach ahead of renewed talks in Geneva. 3 days before the war began, Iran was reaching out. Signals were being sent through diplomatic channels. There was a moment, a brief narrow window where a deal might have been possible, but it closed. According to the Washington Post, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman had multiple phone calls with Trump urging him to attack Iran. And Trump's decision to attack Iran came after the Saudi Arabian and Israeli governments lobbied him repeatedly to make the move. Saudi Arabia, a Sunni Arab kingdom that had spent decades nervously watching a Shia Iran grow more powerful and more aggressive in the region. They wanted Iran weakened, and they got what they wanted. February 28, 2026, before dawn. The opening salvo on February 28, 2026, assassinated Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and several family members in Tehran. The man who had led Iran for over 3 decades, the man behind the entire axis of resistance strategy, the man who had outlasted presidents, kings, and prime ministers, gone. Killed in a strike on his own home. Israel's operation. Roaring Lion and the United States Operation Epic Fury began in the morning hours of Saturday, February 28th. The initial early morning attack resulted in the elimination of over 40 senior Iranian officials and commanders, including the Supreme Leader. 40 officials killed in the opening hours. This was not a strike on nuclear facilities. This was a strike on the entire leadership structure of the Islamic Republic. On 28 February 2026, Israel and the United States began a series of strikes against Iran. And they said they aimed to induce regime change in Iran and target its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Regime change. Those 2 words. After years of denial. After years of saying the goal was only the nuclear program. The mask had come off. Israel and the United States were not just trying to stop a nuclear weapon. They were trying to end the Islamic Republic itself. Iran's response was immediate and overwhelming. Tehran has responded to United States and Israeli strikes by launching waves of missiles and drones at Israel and towards several military bases in the Middle East, where United States forces operate. But Iran did not just target Israel and the United States. It went after the entire Gulf. In retaliation for the joint United States-Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, Tehran launched an unprecedented barrage of missiles and drones at multiple Gulf states. For the first time in history, Iran attacked all Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE for the first time in history. Iran attacked every single Gulf state simultaneously. The region had never seen anything like this. Few Gulf monarchies had anticipated this escalation. For decades, the Gulf territory had remained largely insulated from direct Iranian fire. Since the tanker war of the late 1980s, Tehran had avoided openly targeting the region. Luxury districts in Gulf cities were hit. Civilian airports were targeted. Energy infrastructure was struck. Global oil prices exploded upward. The head of Saudi Arabia's state oil company said that although it will reroute some exports through the Red Sea, continued war would yield drastic effects on the world economy, and the global ripple effects were immediate. Due to high global energy prices, Bangladesh is closing universities early for the summer. Pakistan and the Philippines both declared a 4-day work week. Think about that. A conflict in the Middle East had within weeks forced countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia to restructure their entire working week. International Monetary Fund Chief Kristalina Georgieva said that every 10% increase in energy prices over the course of 2026 is expected to increase global inflation by almost 0.5%. This war is not just a Middle Eastern problem, it is a global economic event. And it was getting more dangerous by the day. At least 180 people were wounded in Iranian missile attacks on the southern city of Dimona, home to the country's main nuclear facility, and nearby Arad, in one of the most dramatic escalations since the United States-Israel war on Iran began. Iran targeted Dimona, Israel's nuclear facility, tit for tat, nuclear site for nuclear site. The nature of the targets was becoming existential. Now, let us talk about what made this conflict fundamentally different from the 12-day war in 2025. A drastic strategic pivot from degrading nuclear infrastructure to executing a decapitation strike against the Iranian leadership has shattered the previous rules of engagement, dragging the region into an open-ended war of attrition with zero diplomatic off-ramps. Zero diplomatic off-ramps. That phrase should terrify anyone paying attention. In June 2025, both sides knew the rules. Hit military targets. Avoid leadership. Leave room for a deal. During the June 2025 war, Israeli and United States forces largely concentrated their firepower on specific nuclear and military facilities in Natanz Fordo and Isfahan, though Tehran also came under heavy attack. While devastating the defined scope of those targets left room for negotiations. There was a defined scope. There was room for a deal. Oman mediated. A ceasefire happened. But in February 2026, Israel and the United States crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. When you kill the supreme leader, you remove the person who has the authority to make a deal. You create a power vacuum. And in power vacuums, the most extreme voices always fill the silence first. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, issued his first public statement since being appointed to the position, demanding the immediate closure of all United States military bases in the Middle East. The statement insisted the Strait of Hormuz must remain closed as leverage against enemies. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated supreme leader, now elevated to one of the most powerful positions in the Islamic world. And his opening move was to demand the closure of every United States military base in the region, for everyone who fills a gas tank or pays an electricity bill. So you have a new Iranian supreme leader threatening to close the strait. Two nuclear-adjacent powers locked in a spiral with no clear exit ramp. And now let us talk about the forces that are still lurking on the edges of this conflict. Because the war has not stayed contained, Yemen's Houthis launched a missile strike against Israel, the group said Saturday. It was the first time the Tehran-backed militia had intervened in the United States' Israeli-led war against Iran, which has entered its second month. The Houthis, based in Yemen, a militia that had already paralyzed Red Sea shipping for months, now re-entering the conflict on Iran's side. And Hezbollah in Lebanon was also moving. Hezbollah, breaking the ceasefire with Israel, fired some 3 rockets at cities across northern Israel, the first attack on Israel by Hezbollah from Lebanon since November 2024. The attacks were met with an immediate response from Israel. The Lebanon ceasefire was breaking down. A second front was opening in the north. Israel was now fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. Against Iran directly, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, against Houthi missiles from Yemen, and facing potential instability in Iraq, where Iranian-backed militias were active. At least 13 United States troops have been reported killed, while in Iraq, where Iranian-supported militia groups have entered the conflict, 80 members of the security forces have died. United States soldiers are dying in Iraq, in Gulf states, and the conflict is widening, not narrowing. Now let us zoom out and ask the question that everyone is asking. What are the real goals here? Because the stated goals and the actual goals are very different things. The United States stated publicly that the goal was to destroy Iran's nuclear program and disarm its ballistic missile capability. Israel's stated goal was similar, but analysts who have been watching this conflict for decades see something else entirely. As its joint attack with the United States on Iran continues, Israel sees its task as the culmination of a long-standing policy on ushering in regime change from within. Taking to the airwaves in the wake of the killing of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Iranian people, directly calling on them in Farsi to come to the streets, come out in your millions, to finish the job to overthrow the regime of fear that has made your lives bitter. Netanyahu was not talking to the Iranian government. He was talking to the Iranian people. He was calling for revolution from the outside, using Israeli and United States bombs as the accelerant. And here is the brutal assessment from one of Israel's own former government advisors. Former Israeli government advisor Daniel Levy told Al Jazeera that Israel has no real interest in smooth regime change. Israel's more interested in regime and state collapse. They want Iran to implode, and if the spillover from that takes in Iraq, the Gulf, and much of the region, so much the better. State collapse, not just regime change, full state collapse. The dismantling of the Islamic Republic, not just as a government, but as a functioning state. If that is truly the goal, then we are not talking about a war with a defined endpoint. We are talking about a generational conflict, one with consequences that no one can fully predict. Because when large states collapse, the results are almost never clean. They are almost never quick. And they are almost never confined to one country. Look at what happened when the state of Iraq was dismantled in 2003. A vacuum was created. And into that vacuum rushed sectarian militias, terrorist groups, and foreign powers. The chaos of that collapse echoed for 2 full decades. Now imagine that scenario with a country 3 times the size of Iraq, with a highly educated population of 90 million people, with nuclear material, with ballistic missiles scattered across a vast geography, with proxies in 6 surrounding countries. The stakes of getting this wrong are almost incomprehensibly high. Now here is something that deserves particular attention: the international legal dimension of this war. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for immediate de-escalation at an Emergency Security Council meeting Saturday, condemning the United States and Israel's strikes as unlawful. Both countries argued their actions were justified given the major nature of the threat posed by Iran. The United Nations Secretary General, the head of the global body created specifically to prevent wars like this, calling the strikes unlawful. And the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog itself, added a significant detail. The International Atomic Energy Agency said that while Iran has an ambitious nuclear program and has refused to allow inspections of its damaged sites since the 2025 war, there was no evidence of a structured nuclear weapons program when the 2026 war began. There was no evidence of a structured nuclear weapons program when the war began. Let that sit for a moment. The justification that had been used for decades to build toward this conflict. The IAEA saying it could find no evidence of an actual weapons program at the moment the bombs started falling. History will judge this moment very carefully, and the humanitarian dimension of this war is devastating. The United Nations International Organization for Migration said that 82,000 civilian buildings in Iran, including hospitals, and the homes of 180,000 people were damaged. 180,000 people's homes damaged. In just the opening weeks. The opening salvo on February 28, 2026, had already killed more than 555 people in Iran, including 180 at a girls' school. A girls' school, 180 children, gone in an instant. These are the numbers that get buried in the geopolitical analysis, but they are the numbers that matter most. The human beings behind the headlines, the families shattered, the cities left dark, the children who will never come home. Meanwhile, the cost of this war is staggering, even for the world's most powerful military. The cost of war's first 6 days for the United States was $11 billion. $11 billion in 6 days. And the war was still ongoing at the 30-day mark. Now, let us think about where this goes from here, because there are several scenarios and none of them are simple. Scenario 1, a negotiated ceasefire. This is what happened in June 2025. Oman mediated. The United States pressured both sides. A deal was struck. But remember what we said earlier. There are 0 diplomatic off-ramps this time. The killing of Khamenei changed everything. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is an unknown quantity. He is younger. He may be more hardline. He has something to prove. And any deal he strikes could be seen as capitulation. Israel and the United States keep striking Iranian targets. The Strait of Hormuz remains contested. Oil prices stay elevated. The global economy slows, and no one wins. Everyone bleeds. This is the most likely short-term scenario. Scenario 3, Iranian state collapse. The protests that brought 5 million people into the streets in January 2026 could reignite. The combination of external military pressure and internal economic devastation could become too much for the regime to manage. The Islamic Republic could fracture. But as we said earlier, a collapsed Iranian state is not a solved problem. It is a new and possibly more dangerous problem. Scenario 4. Escalation to a wider regional war. If the Houthis fully enter the conflict. If Hezbollah launches its full arsenal. If Iraqi militias start attacking United States forces at scale, if any of these escalations trigger a response that brings in additional outside powers. Russia, China, the conflict could spiral beyond anything we have seen in the modern Middle East. None of these scenarios is inevitable. All of them are possible, and the decisions being made right now in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Beijing, those decisions will determine which path we walk down. Let us also address something important. The question of what Iran was actually trying to achieve with its proxy network all these years, because it is too easy to paint Iran purely as an aggressor. The reality is more complex. Various reasons have been given for the Iran-Israel conflict. Iran and Israel had previously enjoyed warm ties due to common threats, but by the 1990s, the USSR had dissolved and Iraq had been weakened. Iranian Islamists have long championed the Palestinian people whom they perceive as oppressed. Scholars believe that by supporting the Palestinians, Iran seeks greater acceptance among Sunnis and Arabs, both of whom dominate the Middle East. Iran sees itself as a defender of the oppressed. That framing may or may not be cynical, but it is genuine in the minds of many Iranians. It is how the government has justified enormous sacrifices, enormous spending on proxy armies rather than domestic infrastructure. The Iranian people have paid a brutal price for their government's regional ambitions. Decades of sanctions, economic stagnation, international isolation. and now open war with the most powerful military alliance in the world. The protests that erupted in January 2026 were not just about politics. They were about people who were exhausted, people who watched their savings evaporate, who watched their currency collapse, who watched their government spend billions arming militias in Yemen and Lebanon while hospitals in Tehran ran out of medicine. That rage was real, it is still real, and it is a force that no missile can silence. Now let us also acknowledge something that often gets overlooked in Western coverage of this conflict. The Israeli civilians who have lived for years under the threat of rocket fire, the residents of northern Israel who were evacuated from their homes after October 7th and could not return for months. By late July 2024, Hezbollah had launched more than 6,000 rockets and 300 drones at Israel, killing 24 civilians and 22 Israeli soldiers. 6,000 rockets, fired at civilian areas, over just the first 9 months of the post-October 7th conflict. There are children in Israel who have spent years learning to run to bomb shelters before they can count to 10. That is a trauma that will shape a generation. And there are children in Gaza who have lost everything: parents, siblings, homes, schools. The human cost of this conflict does not belong to one side. It belongs to everyone caught in the crossfire of decisions made by governments and ideologies that care more about power than people. That is the truth that gets lost in the propaganda from every direction. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at a genuinely historic inflection point. The Iran-Israel conflict has moved through 3 distinct phases: proxy war from 1985 to 2023, direct confrontation from 2024 to 2025, and now in 2026, full open warfare involving the United States, targeting regime leadership. The Iran-Israel conflict is a long-standing geopolitical and military confrontation between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the State of Israel, involving proxy hostilities since 1985 and direct clashes since 2024. We are now in uncharted territory. The rules that kept this conflict from becoming a catastrophe for 4 decades have been torn up. The question is not whether this is the most serious phase yet. It clearly is. The question is whether anyone involved has the wisdom and the courage to find a way out before the damage becomes irreversible, before the fires in Tehran spread in ways that cannot be contained, before the Strait of Hormuz closure sends the global economy into freefall, before another generation of children on all sides grows up knowing nothing but war. History does not move in straight lines. There have been moments in the past when conflicts that seemed unstoppable were stopped, when diplomats found bridges in places where soldiers had only built walls. Those moments require leaders who are willing to prioritize people over ideology, peace over pride, the future over the past. Whether such leaders exist in the rooms where these decisions are being made right now, that is the most important question of our time. And the answer will shape the Middle East and the world for decades to come. This is the Iran-Israel conflict in 2026. The most dangerous phase yet. Watch it closely, because what happens next will matter to all of us.